What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host. And as always, I come to you on so many different social media platforms that you can listen to our podcast. But if you want to get it easy, just go to our website and get our free mobile app. And if you don't want to go to my website, which is fasttracksystem.com, you can also go to www.necchat.com and you can get our mobile app downloaded on your phone. Don't worry, it's not any bloatware. It's just a link to our web-based mobile app because I change it all the time. I add calculators. I had the ability to chat on there, upload pictures. We have blogs on there. You can get to Fast Tracks Tube on there. You got calculators. You've got all kinds of goodies there for free. Not trying to sell you anything. It's free. All right. All right. Welcome to Let's Ask Paul. And today's question was submitted. And I will, kind of tell you just, already I have answered this question for the gentleman. So he's already gotten the email. Because I felt this was one that I could answer while I was on the fly. I think I was traveling or doing something. But anyway, I answered it, and he already got his answer. But Darlene had pinned it because it's still a good question because it digs into a question of tapping feeders. And can you have more than feeders in a system? And, whereas you have a feeder feeding a panel with another feeder. And so, again, it was a great question for us to elaborate on. So I want to go to it right now. It was submitted. And it says, "Hi, Paul. I've been catching some of your coffee hours as I'm getting ready to head out to work. Thanks for doing that. I know you went over feeder taps, but I don't have the time to see the whole hour plus." Boy, what are you trying to say, bro? Are you trying to say that I'm long-winded? Yeah, I know that's what you're saying, but it's okay. I can accept that. I am long-winded. Sometimes I'm obnoxious. Sometimes I'm just not worthy of people wanting to listen to me. That's okay. I don't worry about that type of thing. I'm here to teach. I move on. Positive. Move forward. Okay. So you're asking about feeder taps. Okay. All right. So feeder taps. So let's get into that, and we will go to the rest of your question. Okay. So the question goes on to say, it says, if we look at the definition of feeder and the definition of branch circuit, I feel there's a gap between them, maybe. Okay, now I'm going to show you that there's not a gap, but I get your feeling. It says, we wire large residences and always have a feeder to a sub panel or remote distribution panel or a remote load center, however it makes you feel better. Then they feed another sub panel, load center, remote distribution panel, whatever, from the first sub panel, load center, distribution. If I don't say all of those, I always got somebody that'll post something in a comment somewhere. Those are load centers, Paul, or those are whatever. And I'm like, dude, what do you do every day? Get a life. Okay. I remember years ago, a little story. I remember years ago when people were using the term sub panel and this guy was jumping all over people. He was pretty well-known educator. I don't know where he is today. He's not one of the big, what we call the big three, which I tell you, when I say big three, I mean Ryan Jackson, Mike Holt, and myself. I consider us the big three. Again, you could say, Paul, you're very conceited. I don't care. I think volume and the number of listeners and the stuff that we put out, I think that's the big three. You like it or not, that's just the way I feel about it. Okay. All right. Are there other educators out there? Absolutely. But the big three, that's what we think about. Okay. All right. Anyway, I'll get some hate mail for that shit too. I'm just saying. All right. So anyway, he goes on to say, the wire between the two panels doesn't fit the definition of a feeder or a branch circuit. I'd like to know what it is. Is it a feeder? Could we use the feeder tap rules on it? Bottom line, I'd like to use tap rules on the wires between the two panels. Can we? And thanks. Okay, great question. I appreciate the question. So in understanding this question, we have to realize, what does the code say a feeder is? What is a feeder? So if we go look at the Article 100 under feeder, it says, quote, all circuit conductors between the service equipment, the source of separately derived system, or other power supply source, and the final branch circuit overcurrent device? Folks, so the feeder lies somewhere between the service and what? The branch circuit overcurrent protected device. That might be 2 panels down, but that's where it is. So if I go from the service panel and I put a breaker in there and I'm going to feed a panel that's in my basement, that's a feeder, because that's feeding another panel that has other overcurrent protected devices that are in it for the branch circuits. Feeder. Now, if I feed that panel with a feeder, and now I'm in that second panel and I put another 2-pole breaker in there and I want to feed another panel, which I can, that will have overcurrent protected devices in it that are protecting branch circuits out of that panel downstream, then it is still a feeder because it's taking place between the service equipment and whatever the final overcurrent protection be. And it just so happens that you weren't done when you went from the main service to that panel, then you fed another panel where you ultimately will have the final overcurrent protected device that feeds whatever, let's say, receptacle circuit. Those are all feeders. Can I apply the tap rules to those? Absolutely, I can. If it is feeder, it's that conductor that is between the service equipment and the whatever the final overcurrent protective device is. So I can have a panel feeding another panel, feeding another panel, feeding another panel. Those are feeders. You get me? Okay. So that's kind of one of those things. Now, we know we can't tap a tap. So if you're talking about tap rules 240.21b and you're applying these tap rules to a feeder, just remember the whole concept of a feeder tap is to be able to tap onto a conductor where typically the conductor would be less than the size of the conductor you're tapping, right? And the overcurrent device is protecting the feeder, but it may be too large to traditionally protect the tap conductor that's tapping onto the feeder. Unless you follow the rules in 240.21b, then you're going to see that, you know, in some cases, if you look at it, you're like, okay, you know what? It's okay. It's still protected. And it's protected by the what? The feeder's disconnect. The feeder's overcurrent protection. So again, following those rules, that's why we have tap rules. So it may sound unorthodox, but the conductors are literally protected. Okay, so we can't now take a tap and tap a tap. Can't do that. But we certainly can tap feeders as long as we follow all the rules within the National Electrical Code. Okay, so hopefully that answered your question. Again, for anybody out there, again, that's wondering what we're talking about, again, it's service equipment supplying a remote panel that's in your basement, let's say. And then later you go, well, hey, I want to go from there out to my garage from that panel. Okay, as I have breaker space left in that one, but I don't. And assuming everything's sized okay, whatnot, assuming you've done your load calcs and you know what you're dealing with and you've sized everything accordingly, and you've thought about future expansion and how you want to do this, that's okay. Then I can go from that panel to another panel somewhere else, and it's still a feeder. And you can still apply the tap rules if you want. Okay? That makes sense? Okay, so you really want to look at the definition of feeder, which is, by the way, you know, when you look at it, it's one of those things where you're like, it makes sense only after you read it and you go, oh, okay, it makes sense. You know what I'm saying? All right. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question that you submitted. And I'm glad we could answer it for you on this episode of Let's Ask Paul. Let's see if we have any other questions we want to answer in today's episode. Okay, so let's see. We got time for another one. Let's go on to this one. So this one's submitted, and it's been pinned by Jeff. And I have answered this one. Again, full disclosure, I've already answered the individual, but again, he's marked it because he thinks that many people can learn from this one. So I will use it as a podcast on today. All right, it says, good morning, Paul. So I have a question. I was doing a service upgrade and the existing grounding electrode was already landed in the old panel that was back to back with the old service. Okay. It says, I drove 2 new ground rods and separated the neutrals in the old panel. So now it's a remote distribution panel. Okay. But do I have to run the bare from the water pipe again to reach the outside news service, or is there any rule or exception that can stay in the old existing panel that is back-to-back with the new service? Thank you for your knowledge. Okay, so I've already responded to this one. And let's go through the concept here of what we're saying here. So let me paint you this mental picture. So this gentleman is doing a service change. It was outside, let's say it was the meter, and inside was the original old panel. He's been called to come and do a service change. Now he's got to bring it up to code. He wants to put an emergency disconnect outside. Sounds like that's also going to be his service disconnect as well. So he moves that outside. So now the old panel that was inside now becomes his remote distribution panel. So obviously he's changed all the conductors and now has 4 conductors coming in, that type of thing, because the service disconnect is outside based on what he's kind of explained. So his question is about the water pipe. If that is truly an electrode, then it's terminated now in the remote distribution panel or the load center sub panel, however you want to flavor it. And he's saying, wait a minute, am I screwed at this point? Because now out at the panel outside where my service is, I put in my 2 ground rods. Okay. So here's the first thing that we have to think of. Okay. Now the NEC is still going to demand that GEC be connected. And GEC, by the way, is grounding electroconductor. In this case, to the water pipe. It's still going to be required that get connected to the grounded conductor at the service. Okay. So that is the first part. So we can't get rid of that rule first. So it's got to make that connection. Now we'll look at some options here that may or may not have, but that's the first rule. GECs have to be connected. You find all that in 250.24. Okay, there. All right. Now, one of the things that I will tell this individual is that just because you had the old building had a connection to a water pipe ground electrode, was it actually a water pipe electrode? Did it meet the requirements of 250.52A1? Was it 10 feet in contact with the earth? Did it qualify as an electrode? I know they went to the water pipe. Did they do it within 5 foot of entry? Did they do all those things that would make it smell like a water pipe electrode and all that type of stuff? And you're saying, well, I don't know. Okay, well, if they made a connection to the water pipe in the building and it wasn't at 5 foot of nearest point of entry, and they made it somewhere else, then one of the question is, it's possible that they're just bonding the water pipes, right? And so they may be just bonding them. And if that's the case, they're just following bonding rules. Okay, you're required to bond the metal water piping system if that's what you have. Obviously people today are using PEX and all those other kind of non-metallic products, and you don't bond the water line. But there's a difference between, is there a water pipe electrode? And so you have to qualify that first. So if it is, then you're saying, okay, what can I do? What options may I be able to or have a discussion with the AHJ? Okay. Well, the easiest thing that I would tell you is just move that connection out to the outside service and connect it to the grounded conductor out there. That's the easiest solution, to just move it. Now, you might be saying, well, it's not long enough. Well, you can irreversible crimp it. You can CAD weld it, to extend it. There's options there. If you have a crimp set that's irreversible, probably the easiest option. But there are other things we need to look at here. Okay, so now you didn't say what code cycle you are in. I don't believe you said what code edition you're in. So kind of interesting topic here. So in the 2020 edition and earlier, there was this allowance, okay, and I'm going to use this very loosely. This was what's 250.121 allowance, and this was an allowance where you could use an equipment grounding conductor as also the grounding electrode conductor, which we have done in PV applications for years. There is a provision in there in the 2020 and earlier under 250.121 that says, you know what? Here's an exception that's going to say, you know what? I'll let you use the equipment grounding conductor also as the GEC under the strict rules under this exception. Means that the sizing of that GEC and the sizing of that equipment grounding conductor have to be adequate for whatever purpose they're being used for. And if you're going to be using it also to use it as an equipment grounding conductor as a GEC, then that equipment ground has to be the same size or larger than what it would be required for a GEC. You get what I'm saying? And vice versa. Okay? Same thing if you're using the EGC and you're extending the GEC, it has to be at least the size that the GEC would be required under that exception. Okay? So people are saying in the 2023, Paul, I don't see that. That's because it was moved. It's now under 250.118b. So it was just moved. So the exception is still there. And the exception is one of those things that you're going to really have to sit with your AHJ and you're going to have to really communicate what you're doing here under your unique situation, okay? Because it still has to be size right. If you make the argument and say, okay, look, say that the GEC is connected to the EGC. If the EGC happens to be sized properly, so you can take a 2 AWG copper, let's say, as a GEC to the water pipe, to the electrode. And so in other words, you can't take a 2-gauge copper and connect it to the water pipe ground and then connect it to a size 4 EGC. So the GEC, if it was required to be a 2 and you bring it up into the panel, you can't connect it to, let's say the equipment ground supplying that panel was only a 4-gauge. You can't do that, okay? Because, again, the EGC is smaller than the GEC. I love all these damn acronyms, and we're slowly getting rid of these things in the code. And if you're not familiar with it, GEC is a grounding electrode conductor that goes from the grounding conductor down to the electrode itself. And then that's the GEC. And then the EGC is just an equipment grounding conductor, which also serves as an equipment bonding conductor. Everybody would like to get that verbiage changed, but it serves the same function in many cases. So you have some allowances, okay? Now, we have to look at it. So let's just throw it in a scenario where, the what-if scenario, okay? Because it's there for a reason. What if you have a 200-amp service and you're installing a feeder, okay, and now it's going to be a 200-amp remote distribution inside. So service outside, you continue it on, and it's going to be inside. Okay, now let's assume that the EGC for that 200-amp panel to that feeder panel, which is right now yours is on the other side of the wall, is the EGC is, let's say it's a 6-gauge copper, okay, for 200-amp, okay. Now, let's say that you do have a grounding electroconductor and it's a water pipe that goes a 4, okay? So let's say the GEC to the water pipe is a 4-gauge due to your supply conductors being 2-aught or 3-aught copper, okay? Then you're screwed. Why? Because the EGC was only a 6-gauge and the GEC that's running to the water pipe has to be a 4. You get me? Now, if it was the other way around, where it was a 4 for the EGC and the GEC only had it to be a 6, then it would be equal to or greater. So you'd be okay. And you could argue your point to the AHJ. You could say, look, I want to argue this point and I want to bring up this reference and try to make an argument there. But again, the old saying is you either move it or you prove it, and you'd have to sit with the AHJ and explain what the application is 250.121 if you're in the 2020 code or earlier. And if you're in the 2023, it's 250.118b, and it's there for a reason. And you look at the exception and see if you can't create a plausible argument that they may accept. You get what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So that is the only argument that we would have. Now, the only additional argument that we could make for somebody could make is that, well, aren't you now at this point splicing the GEC? And didn't the code say that it had to be irreversible or CAD welding? Yes. So that's probably the next logical thing that you're going to have to face is say, well, what can I do and how do I make this connection? I'm going to make it, whether I, CAD weld it, kind of hard to do if it's in the panel already. That's going to be kind of hard to do. Or I do a irreversible crimp type of scenario. You're going to have to work those things through your AHJ. You just are. Because if that is your grounding out. But again, I would also qualify whether or not that water pipe, if it's an old house, there is a possibility that they've changed it outside to plumbing is the PVC. There's a high probability that it's just, if the whole house is metal piping, that's just a bonding component, right? And those type of things. And so you're just bonding. So yeah, there's other rules that you can look at, but that's where I'd start the journey and see how that works and have a discussion with your AHJ. See if they can, you can have a meeting of the minds. See if that works for you. All right, folks, that's it. That's about 20 minutes today. That's all I really wanted to get in our podcast for today. Hopefully you got something out of it. Again, as always, if you want to ask us questions and get my take on something, and if I don't get it on the first take, remember, you can always contact me back and ask me follow-up questions. Just make sure you let me know what episode it is. Give me a brief summary of what I talked about. That way I don't have to go back and listen to the entire podcast again. I don't like going backwards. I like going forward, and I've done over 1,000 podcasts. I can't remember everything that I've talked about, okay? I got ADD. I always like to keep moving forward. All right, folks, till next time, stay safe. God bless, and we'll catch you on another episode of Let's Ask Paul.